Beautiful like a fresco and fascinating for its idiosyncrasies, Street Fighter III Third Strike is a melting pot of both popular culture and fighting game design. This is the Annotated Third Strike. Sometimes there are victims of circumstance. They can't help it. In any given situation, there's always a presence that just can't get ahead. Pick your favorite oppressive force: wealth, social status, societal factors, and there will be an odd man out, a talent that was destined to fail within the constraints they're found. Perhaps it's a lack of foresight, as if whomever put this person in this situation failed to factor in all the variables. Maybe it's a lack of tools, as if the skill set in question just wasn't where it should be. Regardless, some of us just weren't meant to function where they are. Some of us are just Remys. Remy is one of the few characters made specifically for Third Strike that hasn't branched out into further entries in the larger franchise. Much like the Lost 5 characters from the original Street Fighter, Remy, 12, and to a certain extent Cube were one and done in Third Strike, and have yet to return as playable characters. In Remy's case, it makes sense though. Remy's playstyle closely matches up with recurring series hero and original combo machine Guile, with his projectile-heavy game and back-flipping anti-air kick. The thing is, no one told Remy that playing like Guile doesn't yield the same results in this Street Fighter compared to nearly all of the others. Remy, sadly, wasn't designed to be bad, but in a way, he was. The design team, for their part, were trying to duplicate what they had done with the twins, to will a character into popularity. In a GameBest interview recently translated by Schmupulations, the team says that he was the hardest character to create in terms of visual design. When looking at the overall cast, they said they needed what they called a BK, or beautiful type character. Starting early work during Second Impact's production, some 40 to 50 different designs were made. These ranged from a BK Doctor, to a BK Prince, to a BK Priest as the final contender, before settling on the long-haired nihilist we have in the game. In a recent post on the Capcom Fighters Network Online Vault, Street Fighter V producer Takayuki Nakayama even shows designs for a Shadowloo punk that was originally going to have multiple personalities and fight with poison-based attacks, something Nakayama circled back to ultimately. Given the late 90s and early 2000s trend in Japanese game design, at least from a visual standpoint, this makes a certain degree of sense. With games like Symphony of the Night, for example, franchises like the Castlevania series successfully transitioned their protagonists from macho barbarian-type characters to attractive men with more feminine features, commonly found in Bishonen manga. Japanese RPGs were also straying from more common fantasy tropes by this point, and feature these same BK designs in blockbuster Final Fantasy games. The trend was there, and Capcom was simply taking advantage of shifting sensibilities and visual style. The name Remy actually lends to this, as it's a unisex French name deriving from the Latin word remiges, meaning oar or oarsman. Given all of that though, the GameBest interview says that he was the last of the new characters for Third Strike to have their design completed. They took a long, frank look at the fighting style or type of playable character that was missing from the game and focused on its development from there. Early sketches indicate more of a close-range fighter, with grapples and sidesteps, but these types of techniques were already in the game though. What they settled on then was Remy as a distance fighter, or a zoning character in competitive fighting game parlance. The GameBest interview goes on to state they had envisioned him as a hardcore martial artist like Alex and Ryu, and wanted him to be a rival to them with characteristics to counter their abilities. His playstyle certainly is different than either of them, and though we don't have anything further to go on, we're left to wonder if they perhaps took the philosophy a little bit too far. Of course, we'll come back to this. The GameBest interview mentions that Remy was supposed to flesh out more of Street Fighter III's story, which is sad given we know practically nothing about him. The Street Fighter Eternal Challenge mentioned that he had a martial artist father that had abandoned him and his older sister at a young age. Consumed with hatred for fighters of all kinds, the only thing that he loved in the world was his sister, and he encased her in ice after her untimely death. This sets up something of an ice and water motif with him, a name that means ore, a cold and icy personality, and special move names to match. As mentioned, Remy is something of a nihilist, judging by his win quotes, but Eternal Challenge goes so far as to call him insane. Regardless, he begins to shed these traits, as far as we know, in his ending of the game. Still, this sets up some mysteries that will likely never be answered, mostly revolving around who Remy's father is or was, and if this absentee parent is floating around in plain sight. Since Third Strike is the end of the Street Fighter series timeline as of this recording, we can only speculate, but the series and its characters' relationships are built upon coincidence. It's not unreasonable to assume that Remy and his sister may be illegitimate children of Guile or Alpha series character Charlie Nash, given their remarkably similar skill sets. But again, we'll never know. His stage is set at the Club Metro at 11:29 p.m., which also, again, is about all we know about it. It certainly takes place in front of a European disco, which means it's a dance club, something Americans are often confused by.
His voice actor is Eiji Sekiguchi, a veteran anime and gaming voiceover artist known for Yu Yu Hakusho and Fairy Tail.
His fighting style is savate, the French kickboxing system that evolved from Parisian street fighters and sailors from the south of France in the 19th century. In one of his pre-match intros, he even gives what is called the savate salute, which is in essence the sport's form of bowing. In both the northern and southern pupil stage of the form, punches were slaps and open-handed attacks, which you'll notice that Remy largely uses, because closed fist strikes were illegal in France during this period. Savate became somewhat more formalized in the mid-1800s and then later codified under a man named Count Pierre Baruzzi. It still exists today and is taught the world over. Parisian fighters before Baruzzi wore large boots or heavy shoes to do as much damage as possible, which the sport had embraced with required footwear. While most characters have large feet in this game, this at least explains the unusual size of Remy's boots. And this is a good segue into the things that he does well. He has a few proximity normal moves, and many of his attacks can cancel or link into specials and supers. The low attacks are more interesting though. The crouching hard kick is a sweep that swings around for a second chance to hit, exactly like Guile in Street Fighter II. His crouching hard punch will launch for a juggle, which is commonly used for a brief combo. His jumping hard punch will hit opponents into a falling juggle ready state when met air to air. His neutral throw can also be used to juggle opponents in the corner, which is commonly seen in competitive matches. His overhead is somewhat novel among the cast, as it doesn't really come from a very high overhead angle, more of a scooting downward kick to complement his universal overhead. His taunt boosts his stun output. True to the majority of the cast too is that Remy has a quick target combo with close medium kick and hard kick. While it's a fine attack string on its own, it is, however, illustrative of Remy's flaws, and there are many. First, Remy's a charge character, so he needs to hold back on the stick for a brief moment before pressing another direction in an attack button. This is true for his projectile, the Light of Virtue, which can be thrown either high or low, much like another past franchise favorite, Sagat. The EX version will send out 2 shots in different patterns depending on the use of the punch or kick buttons. This is his most commonly used weapon in competitive play to keep foes at a distance. Then there's the Rising Rage Flash, performed with a downward charge and then up and kick. The EX version hits twice. This is a common anti-air move and combo ender. His final special is the Cold Blue Kick, which hops him a certain distance forward depending on the strength of the button pressed. Sadly, it doesn't combo out of anything. The EX version, as you might have guessed, hits twice, but it does keep him in the air briefly. This all means that his target combo, which is proximity specific, is one of the most damaging punishes without a charge for a special move, or a stock full of meter for a super art. To broaden the scope a bit, basically all of his combos are 2 to 3 hits outside of supers. His damage potential then is pretty low. This is significant. Other characters like Ryu have relatively short combos as well, but at much higher damage or gained screen position. Remy, though, is constantly charging for attacks that net relatively little reward. In other games, this wouldn't be much of a problem, because a character like Remy wants to frustrate opponents at a distance or bait them into jumping in for anti-air counterattacks. He plays the long game, and with his slow-moving projectiles, he can attempt to control the playfield by locking his foes into places far across from him. With the parry system, though, swatting away projectiles or anti-air moves is par for the course. Without high damage combos to threaten at close range, there just isn't much to Remy. His effectiveness is reduced compared to Guile's in an older game. There are some interesting things to say about his super arts, though. The Light of Justice is a flurry of lights of virtue that come in at arcing angles, which makes it challenging to parry at full distance. It will always push the opponent to the other side of the screen, though, either by knocking them back on hit or by simply blocking too many shots. Its name in the Japanese version, though, roughly translates into Supernova of Rage. For whatever reason, Capcom USA completely renamed his attacks. The second super art, the Supreme Rising Flash, is called the Virginal Rest in the Japanese version. It's 3 Rising Rage Flashes, a move which roughly translates into My Beloved's Grief in Japan. This is the most damaging move Remy has. Finally, there is the Blue Nocturne, or Heartbroken Nocturne in Japanese. This is a counterattack super, something Capcom would use in later games in the Street Fighter franchise after Third Strike. Activating the move puts Remy in a defensive state that will auto-combo an opponent if he's attacked. Notable in the combo is a back kick that's only seen when this move activates. While certainly experimental, implementing this into a game that already sports a complex countering system like the parry mechanic can be diplomatically called a curious move. This can be useful if Remy uses it after a wake-up if they know an opponent is going to attack, but most players can sniff out when this is coming. Others contend that this move was always meant for high-skill players to use after a red parry. Regardless, this technique, as you'd expect, is his least used super. But that's probably indicative of Remy as a whole. Just not a lot of practical use. To add insult to injury too, he has the lowest stun meter in the game, so characters like Necro, Ryu, and Makoto can really run him over if they mount a good offense. Still, there are great Remy players in the tournament scene, and some make a good run of it at Cooperation Cup every year. Like Urien, he can take advantage of charge partitioning to produce plenty of mobility to complement his projectile game, but Remy will always be low tier. He's just too good for this world.